Okay, we have made it to the last passage in chapter 5. And this one is going to be fun because we are going to do a deep dive on passage 12. So, first of all, take a look at it. And I'll tell you going in, this does contain an argument. So read it over and ask, what is the ultimate conclusion? I'll also tell you this, it's stated. So find it, underline it, give it number 1, pause the video, do that, come back when you're ready. Okay, this can be hard to see. I think that the ultimate conclusion, it's been a while since we've done this, is psychotherapists should have philosophical training. There. Do you notice something interesting about the placement of that ultimate conclusion? Think about that for a bit. Pause the video, come back when you're ready. Okay, do you notice anything interesting about the placement? It is in between other parts of the argument, right? This stuff before the conclusion is important. The stuff after the conclusion is important. So what does that tell us about the probable overall structure of this argument? Think about that for a minute. Pause the video, come back when you're ready. Multiple lines of reasoning, right? If this thing is competently written, chances are excellent that the ultimate conclusion is going to be after one line of reasoning and before another. There might be multiple lines of reasoning on one side or the other, but the ultimate conclusion will be situated in between some of them. So let's take a look. Some psychological suffering stems from philosophical crises, and philosophical training helps psychotherapists to address philosophical crises. Is anything there going to be important? Well, yeah, for sure. There's the that's why, right? So that tells us that the stuff before is going to be given as a reason to believe this part. How many important claims will be there? 1, 2, or 3 out of that first sentence? Pause the video, think for a bit, come back when you're ready. I'm seeing 2. I would divide around the and. Now, true, and is not an inference indicator expression, so it's not like the sky will fall if you don't, but it is a heck of a good idea to do it unless you have pressing reasons not to. For one thing, it allows us to evaluate them separately, and sometimes that's useful to do. For another thing, sometimes there will be a reason given for one of those claims and not the other, and that's impossible to represent unless we divide those claims. Good. How do you think the 2 and the 3 are going to be related to each other? With an inference, with a plus, or 2 separate arrows? Think about that for a bit. Represent that, write it down somewhere, and once you're finished, after you pause the video, come back. Okay, I think with a plus, right? For one thing, it's an and. Ands are usually going to be pluses unless it's an and so. And also, I think they hook together really well with the puzzle piece test. Let's check. Some psychological suffering stems from philosophical crises. Philosophical training helps psychotherapists to address philosophical crises. So what's in common here is philosophical crises and philosophical crises. The leftover bit would be some psychological suffering and philosophical training helps therapists to address. That looks like something we've maybe seen before. So I'm going to add them. 2 plus 3. Now, as soon as we see the 2 claims are added, we should ask, does it look like something follows from them, or do we think that a dilemma is being set up and we should wait for a third part? What do you think? Pause, think, come back. I don't see a dilemma here. We don't have an or statement. We don't have an if-then statement. I think something follows from 2 and 3. What do you think follows from 2 and 3? Well, let's go through that again. What I had just said earlier about thinking about the puzzle piece test. Some psychological suffering stems from philosophical crises. As we saw, philosophical crises is in common between the 2 and the 3. So whatever follows from 2 and 3 will be composed of the other bit, because philosophical crises is where those puzzle pieces connect. What would that be? Some psychological suffering stems from philosophical training helps psychotherapists to address. What would that be? Maybe philosophical training helps psychotherapists to address the thing from which psychological suffering stems. What would that be? I think that's close to 1, that psychotherapists should have philosophical training. So I would be perfectly fine with saying, let's just have 2 and 3 going down to 1 here, taking us directly to 1. Okay. Good. And I put it at the angle because I know there's going to be multiple lines of reasoning in virtue of where the ultimate conclusion is. Additionally, psychotherapists work with vulnerable populations. Is that going to be important? I think so. So that is going to be number 4. Now, I'm not going to ask, how is 4 related to the 2-3 bit? Because once a line of reasoning is over, it's probably over. We've started effectively a new argument here. So I'm just going to continue to read. Professionals who work with vulnerable populations are bound by a code of professional ethics. I think that's going to be important too. So let's have that be number 5. Now I have 2 claims. I'm not going to want to have more than 2 claims in my head at a time, usually. So let's ask, how are 4 and 5 related to each other, do you think? With an inference, with a plus as dependent reasons, or 2 separate arrows? Think about that. Pause the video, come back when you're ready. Okay, let's think about maybe an inference. Let's just think about this. Could it be 4 is a reason to believe 5? Would that work? Let's double check. Let's do the try it out test. Could I convince someone of 5 by telling them 4? Professionals who work with vulnerable populations are bound by a code of professional ethics. You don't believe me? Well, psychotherapists work with vulnerable populations. I don't think that's going to convince anyone. They would say, yeah, I know, I just don't think that those people are bound by a code of professional ethics. Okay, let's try it the other way. Let's try maybe 5 being given as a reason to believe 4. Psychotherapists work with vulnerable populations. You don't believe me? Well, professionals who work with vulnerable populations are bound by a code of professional ethics. Again, I mean, I think someone could say, yeah, I know they are. I just don't think that psychotherapists work with vulnerable populations. Okay, so not that. So it's not going to be 5 to 4, and it's not going to be 4 to 5. If you still have a tendency to think that maybe they are related to each other, and I hope you do, they're probably going to be plussed. Let's check that. We are now adding 4 and 5. Should we ask what follows from 4 and 5? Or should we wait for a third part, recognizing that maybe a dilemma is being set up here? Think about that, pause the video, come back when you're ready. I see no dilemma, right? 4 is not an or statement. 5 is not an if-then statement. There's no dilemma here. So I think that we should ask what follows from 4 and 5. Ask yourself, what follows from 4 and 5? Figure that out and write that down. Pause the video, Do that, come back when you're ready. Okay, let's see. 4 plus 5 would give us what? Psychotherapists work with vulnerable populations. Professionals who work with vulnerable populations are bound by a code of professional ethics. Again, let's think about the puzzle piece test. What do they have in common? Working with vulnerable populations. What's left over? Sorry about that. What's left over from 4? Psychotherapists. What's left over from 5? Bound by a code of professional ethics. So it looks like that is what follows from 4 and 5. Psychotherapists are bound by a code of professional ethics, right? Let's double check that. Psychotherapists work with vulnerable populations. Professionals who work with vulnerable populations are bound by a code of professional ethics. Those two claims snap together at working with vulnerable populations. What's left over from 4 is psychotherapists. What's left over from 5 is bound by a code of professional ethics. And sure enough, there we have it in 5, in this conclusion from 4 and 5. Psychotherapists are bound by a code of professional ethics. Ta-da. Now, we aren't sure that that's going to be an unstated conclusion. Maybe that's going to be stated. So let's continue to read. Do we hear that next? Anyone who's bound by a code of professional ethics should be trained in that code. No, we don't hear that next. That's another claim. So that's not going to be stated. The thing that follows from 4 and 5 is not going to be stated. We need to add it as a missing subconclusion, just like we did before. So I will take out that question mark and I will put in A. And we have seen that the next important claim is anyone who's bound by a code of professional ethics should be trained in that code. That's going to be another claim. That's going to be 6. What do you think I'm going to ask now? I'm going to ask, how is 6 related to the A45 bit? Is it going to be related with an inference, an arrow? Is it going to be added to something? Or is it going to be another line of reason completely? Separate arrow. So think about that. Pause the video. Come back when you're ready. Okay, I'm thinking added, right? It looks like it's added. And added to what? Well, compare 6 and A. Psychotherapists are bound by a code of professional ethics. Anyone who is bound by a code of professional ethics should be trained in that code. It looks like those work together really well to me because they have that in common. They can be joined at the notion of being bound by a code of professional ethics. And there we have it. Now, this is a fine map of the argument. But I said I wanted to do a deep dive on this thing, and I do. When I drew this arrow, that might have been a little fast for some of you. You might have thought, well, does 1 really follow from A and 6? Maybe what we should do is ask what does follow from A and 6, what really follows. Now, it is, I think, clearly true that the author of this argument wants us to go directly from this missing subconclusion and this premise to the ultimate conclusion. Absolutely. But that trip is actually composed of 2 smaller trips. There is a missing conclusion that follows directly from A and 6. See if you can think about what B is, right? So if 1 were not there to distract us, and if we were just looking at A and 6, what would we conclude from them? A plus 6 gives us this other thing, B. What would that be? So pause the video, think about that, come back when you're done. Okay, let's check. Psychotherapists are bound by a code of professional ethics, says A. Anyone who's bound by a code of professional ethics should be trained in that code, says 6. What's in common between A and 6 is being bound by a code of professional ethics. That's where those two puzzle pieces join. So the leftover bit from A that's going to show up in the missing subconclusion is going to be psychotherapists. And the leftover part from 6 that is going to show up in the missing subconclusion should be trained in that code. That is to say, the code of professional ethics that binds them. So psychotherapists should be trained in their code of professional ethics. That's what really follows from A and 6. So if we were to evaluate that inference, the inference that takes us from A plus 6 to B, that's perfect. Kind of a crooked grin, it's good. What about the inference that takes us from B to 1 though? Because remember, this inference that goes from A and 6 to 1 is actually a big trip that's composed of 2 smaller trips. So what we're doing, if you haven't figured this out already, is we're evaluating the big trip by evaluating the smaller trips out of which it is composed. The first leg of the journey, fine. What about the second leg of the journey? Now there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can ask, if Bob believes B, how likely is Bob going to be to believe 1? But that's not quite deep enough for me. I want to evaluate this inference from B to 1 by figuring out what the missing premise is that we would need to believe in order to make that trip. Just to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to draw that inference there. Okay. What is C? What am I assuming when I go from B to 1? Now, it's been a while since we've done this. This is kind of like a chapter 3 skill. Think about an if-then sentence that is composed of the unique part from B and the unique part from 1 put together properly. So figure out what B and 1 are both talking about. Ignore that. That will help you to see what the unique part of B is. That's going to be the if part. And what the unique part of 1 is, that's going to be the then part. Put them together, and that's going to be your C. So think about that. Pause the video, do it, come back when you're ready. Okay, let us see. What is C? Well, psychotherapists should be trained in their code of professional ethics, says B. Psychotherapists should have philosophical training, says 1. What's in common between B and 1? Psychotherapists. So what's the leftover unique part from B? Trained in a code of professional ethics. So if trained in a code of professional ethics, then what's the leftover part from 1? Philosophical training. But that needs to be grammatified. So how about training in a code of professional ethics is philosophical training? That's really what's being assumed. Can you see that? If I say psychotherapists should be trained in their code of professional ethics, therefore they should have philosophical training, I'm assuming that training in a code of professional ethics is philosophical training. Is that true? Well, I've never been trained in a code of professional ethics in the same way that like a social worker would be or a psychotherapist would be, but it's not obvious to me that that's true. I think that philosophical training is a little bit more critical of any kind of ethical code. Part of what a philosophical ethics course might be would be to say, well, why is this part of the ethical code that says it's wrong to do X? Is that true? Why is it really wrong to do X, right? I suspect. So I suspect that being trained in a code of professional ethics is not necessarily philosophical training. So if I am right, what does that tell us about this second leg of the journey? It tells us that it's bad, correct? It tells us that it's bad. Why? Because it assumes something that I think might be false. What does that tell us about this inference that takes us from A plus 6 to 1? Well, it's probably bad too. Why? Well, because it is a journey composed out of two smaller journeys, and the second part of the journey is bad, right? So it's not a safe trip. You're fine maybe for the first half of the trip, but then you're going to get in trouble for the second half of the trip. That is a super deep dive. Think about what we did. We had to fill in 2 missing subconclusions and a missing premise. Let's just pause to take a look at that. Do you see why C is a missing premise and not a missing subconclusion? It's because there's no arrow going down to it, right? It's a premise. Now, would we have had to do that? No. If we would have had A plus 6 going straight down to 1, I think that's fine. I think that's what the author of the argument really intended. We would do this if we really wanted to kind of dig into that inference and say, let's think about how this works, right? It's just nice to be able to do that when we want to. We can dig down by supplying missing subconclusions and missing premises. Sometimes that can be incredibly illuminating. Okay, one more thing. I want to take a look at the chart that follows, but we'll do that next time. Thanks. Bye.